There is a title that appears on every British coin in circulation today. 4 Latin letters, F.D., Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. The Pope gave that title to Henry VIII in 1521 as a reward for defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther. 13 years later, Henry tore England out of Rome, dissolved 900 monasteries, and made himself head of his own church. The title stayed. That contradiction, a king who earned a papal honor and then declared the Pope irrelevant, is the Tudor dynasty in miniature. For 118 years, from a battlefield in Leicestershire to a deathbed in Surrey, 5 monarchs remade England through war, fire, faith, and betrayal. By the time this ends, you will understand exactly how a single family turned the most dangerous crown in Europe into the foundation of a global empire. It starts with a usurper and a hawthorn bush, England, before the Tudors. Before the Tudors, England was bleeding out. The Wars of the Roses, 30 years of civil war between the Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the royal family, had burned through 6 kings in 24 years. Nobles switched allegiances like mercenaries. Battlefields at Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury left thousands dead, and the English nobility hollowed out. By 1485, the Yorkist king Richard III sat on a throne he had seized from his own 12-year-old nephew, Edward V, who vanished inside the Tower of London along with his younger brother Richard, and was never seen again. Richard III was crowned, but he was not trusted. And across the Channel, a man with a thin Lancastrian bloodline and almost no military record was preparing to gamble everything on a single battle, Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with roughly 2,000 French mercenaries and marched east. On August 22nd, he met Richard III at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard had more men and held higher ground. What he didn't have was loyalty. The Stanley family commanded thousands of soldiers positioned on the field's edge and waited. When Richard spotted Henry slightly exposed near the battle line and personally charged to cut him down, a desperate gamble born of a king who knew his support was crumbling. The Stanleys finally moved, not for Richard, for Henry. Richard III was surrounded and killed, the last English king to die in battle. A crown found beneath a hawthorn bush was placed on Henry's head, where he stood, still breathing hard from the field. Henry VII, the king who survived by thinking. Henry VII was never glamorous. He was cautious, meticulous, and quietly ruthless. Exactly what England needed after 30 years of civil war. He married Elizabeth of York in January 1486, uniting the Lancaster and York bloodlines and giving his dynasty legitimacy that conquest alone could never provide. He established the Court of Star Chamber to prosecute powerful nobles directly, bypassing local juries that could be bought or intimidated. He revived feudal financial rights, wardship, marriage, relief, filling the treasury through legal extraction. He negotiated the Magnus Intercursus trade treaty with the Low Countries in 1496, securing English wool merchants access to Antwerp markets. When he died in April 1509, he left a full treasury, a stable nobility, and a throne his son could inherit without fighting for it. That alone was a Tudor miracle. The son he left behind had every quality his father suppressed: appetite, ambition, charisma, and no patience for caution. England had no idea what was coming. the young Henry VIII, defender of the faith. The contrast with his father was immediate and total. Henry VIII, at 17, was over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, fluent in Latin and French, a genuine theologian who also composed music and dominated the jousting yard. In 1521, he personally wrote Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, a theological rebuttal of Martin Luther's attack on the Catholic sacraments. Pope Leo X was so impressed, he awarded Henry the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. It was the highest honor the papacy could bestow on a secular ruler. 13 years later, he would declare the Pope had no authority over England whatsoever. The title, however, never left. It remains on British coins to this day, a permanent record of the most spectacular theological reversal in English history. Cardinal Wolsey, the minister who ran England. From 1515 onward, England was effectively governed by Thomas Wolsey. Son of an Ipswich butcher, Wolsey had climbed to become Archbishop of York, Lord Chancellor, and papal legate simultaneously. He ran foreign policy, managed the chancery courts, controlled church appointments, and built Hampton Court Palace on a scale that openly rivaled royal residences. In 1520, he orchestrated the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a diplomatic summit between Henry and Francis I near Calais, where both kings competed in such extreme displays of wealth that the temporary structures included fountains flowing with wine. For 15 years, Henry let Wolsey operate because Wolsey delivered results. When he stopped delivering, Henry's patience evaporated completely, and Wolsey had no floor to land on. The succession crisis. By the early 1520s, Catherine of Aragon had been pregnant at least 6 times. A daughter, Mary, survived. Every son died within weeks or arrived stillborn. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother Arthur, though she always maintained that marriage was never consummated, making Henry's theological argument simultaneously compelling and convenient. Leviticus 20:21 forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. If the first marriage had been real, Henry's was invalid. He demanded an annulment from Pope Clement VII. The problem was structural and immovable. Clement was effectively a prisoner of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V after imperial troops sacked Rome in 1527. Charles was Catherine's nephew. He was not going to allow the Pope to publicly humiliate his family. Wolsey spent years attempting this diplomatic impossibility. He failed. In 1529, Henry stripped him of his offices. Wolsey died in November 1530, traveling south to face treason charges, reportedly saying, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." The most powerful churchman in England was dead. The solution Henry chose next would shatter 1,000 years of English Christianity. Anne Boleyn and the point of no return. Anne Boleyn refused to become Henry's mistress, marriage or nothing. But Henry's desire for Anne alone does not explain what followed. The break with Rome was equally driven by a genuine theological argument that papal authority over England had no scriptural foundation, and by the political opportunity to seize church wealth that reformers and crown advisors had been circling for years. Anne was the catalyst, not the sole cause. Between 1532 and 1534, Parliament passed acts that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The Act in Restraint of Appeals declared England legally self-complete, requiring no external authority, including to the popes. The Act of Supremacy in November 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry married Anne secretly in January 1533. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer annulled the marriage to Catherine. By September, Anne had given birth. The child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Thomas Cromwell and the dissolution of the monasteries. Thomas Cromwell replaced Wolsey as Henry's chief minister and proved himself more dangerous and more systematic. Where Wolsey had ruled through personal relationships, Cromwell worked through parliament and legislation, building administrative infrastructure that gave the crown durable power. From 1536 onward, he organized the dissolution of the monasteries, the systematic closure and asset stripping of every monastic house in England, Wales, and Ireland. Around 900 institutions were dissolved over 4 years. Their lands, perhaps a quarter of all English real estate, were seized by the crown and sold to the gentry. Those buyers became the Reformation's most committed defenders because reversing it now meant surrendering property they had legally purchased. It was one of the largest property transfers in English history, designed to make the break with Rome's structurally irreversible. The Pilgrimage of Grace, 1536, the north of England did not accept the dissolution quietly. In October 1536, between 30,000 and 40,000 men rose under Yorkshire lawyer Robert Aske, marching beneath a banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, the largest popular revolt Henry ever faced. They demanded the monasteries restored, Cromwell removed, and the religious changes reversed. Henry negotiated, offered pardons, and waited. When a smaller second uprising broke out in early 1537, he voided every pardon. Aske was arrested, condemned for treason, and executed in York. Hung in chains from the walls of Clifford's Tower as a visible warning. Around 200 other rebel leaders were executed alongside him. The North was suppressed. The resentment planted there never fully died. Anne Boleyn falls, 1536. Anne Boleyn's positions collapsed with terrifying speed. After Elizabeth's birth, she miscarried twice more, including what appeared to be a male fetus in January 1536. Henry was already showing interest in Jane Seymour, one of Catherine's former ladies-in-waiting. Thomas Cromwell constructed charges against Anne: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and conspiracy against the king's life. The evidence was thin and circumstantial. The trial was not designed to find truth. Anne was convicted and beheaded on Tower Green on May 19, 1536. A swordsman brought from Calais for a cleaner death than the axe. Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour the following morning and married her 11 days after the execution. The last 4 wives and the death of Henry Jane Seymour gave Henry what years of crisis had failed to produce: a living male heir. Edward was born at Hampton Court on October 12, 1537. Jane died of puerperal fever 12 days later. The 3 marriages that followed moved faster and ended worse. Anne of Cleves arrived in January 1540 after Cromwell arranged the match based on a flattering Holbein portrait. Henry found her physically repellent in person, and the marriage was annulled after 6 months. Cromwell, whose political position was already weakening, was arrested in June 1540 and executed for treason and heresy in July. Catherine Howard, a teenager and Anne Boleyn's cousin, became queen shortly after and was executed in February 1542 on adultery charges. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th wife, was Protestant-leaning, intellectually serious, and skilled enough to survive him. Henry VIII died January 28, 1547. 55 years old, barely able to walk, his legs wrapped in bandages over wounds that had been suppurating for years. He left 3 children, a broken church, and a throne that 3 very different people were about to fight over. 3 heirs, 2 irreconcilable faiths, 1 crown. Edward VI, the Protestant experiment. Edward VI was 9 years old at his accession and already more committed to Reformed Protestantism than almost any adult in his government. His uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, governed as Lord Protector and pushed the Reformation hard and fast. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer produced the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549, an English-language Protestant liturgy replacing the Latin Mass across the entire country. The speed of change triggered 2 simultaneous rebellions: the Western Rising in Devon and Cornwall, where Cornish protesters called the new prayer book a Christmas game and demanded the return of the Latin Mass, and Ket's Rebellion in Norfolk, where Robert Ket led as many as 16,000 men encamped on Mousehold Heath outside Norwich in protest against the enclosure of common land. Both were suppressed by force. Somerset's handling of the dual crises was judged inadequate by his rivals. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, removed Somerset from the protectorship in late 1549 and had him executed in January 1552. Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland, controlled both the regime and the dying boy king, Lady Jane Grey. 9 days by spring, 1553, Edward VI was most likely dying of pulmonary tuberculosis, aged 15. His half-sister Mary, the legal heir under Henry VIII's Third Succession Act, was a committed Catholic. Northumberland persuaded the dying king to sign a device for the succession, diverting the crown to Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant great-granddaughter of Henry VII and Northumberland's own daughter-in-law. Edward died on July 6, 1553. Jane was proclaimed queen. She lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor had fled to Norfolk and was rallying support faster than anyone in London had anticipated. The Privy Council's nerve broke entirely. They switched allegiance to Mary and sent men to arrest Northumberland. He was executed in August 1553. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower and beheaded in February 1554, aged 17. Queen for 9 days, prisoner for 7 months, executed for a throne she had never wanted. Mary Tudor now had her crown. She had waited through humiliation, illegitimacy, and enforced silence for this moment. What she did with it would make her the most controversial ruler England had ever seen. Mary I takes the throne. Mary Tudor was 37 when she rode into London through crowds thousands deep, church bells ringing across the city. Genuine public goodwill that she would spend at considerable speed. Henry VIII had declared her illegitimate after annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, forced her to renounce her mother, and stripped her of her royal title for years. Her Catholic faith had been the one thing no one could legislate away from her. She moved immediately and decisively. The Edwardian religious legislation was repealed. Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived as papal legate, and in November 1554, at a ceremony in Parliament, formally reconciled England with Rome, the first time the country had been in communion with the papacy since 1534. Protestant bishops were removed from their sees, and in February 1555, the first executions for heresy began. The Marian persecutions, 1555 to 1558. Between February 1555 and November 1558, approximately 284 Protestants were burned at the stake under the restored heresy laws. Victims ranged from bishops to weavers and apprentices. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley were burned together in Oxford on October 16, 1555. Latimer reportedly said to Ridley as the fire was lit, "We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had initially recanted his Protestant faith under pressure, then publicly recanted the recantation at the stake, deliberately thrusting the hand that had signed the document into the flames first. The burnings were concentrated in London and the southeast, conducted publicly, and produced the opposite of their intended effect. Protestant martyrology hardened resistance rather than eliminating it. John Foxe documented the executions in his Book of Martyrs, published in 1563, cementing Bloody Mary in Protestant memory for generations. Philip II, false pregnancies, and the loss of Calais. Mary married Philip II of Spain at Winchester Cathedral in July 1554. The marriage treaty carefully limited Philip's powers in England, but his interests inevitably pulled English foreign policy toward Spanish priorities. In 1557, England entered the war between Spain and France. In January 1558, the French captured Calais, England's last territorial possession on the French mainland, held since Edward III took it by siege in 1347. 211 years of English presence in France, lost in days. Mary reportedly said Calais would be found written on her heart when she died. The marriage produced nothing else. Mary experienced 2 episodes of abdominal swelling she believed were pregnancies, but neither was. Philip returned permanently to Spain in 1557. Mary died on November 17, 1558, most likely of uterine or ovarian cancer, aged 42. She had burned nearly 300 people, lost the last piece of English France, and left the throne to the Protestant half-sister she reportedly despised. The woman waiting to inherit had spent years watching, learning, and surviving. She had been imprisoned, suspected, and underestimated her entire life. That was about to become her greatest weapon, Elizabeth I. The survivor takes power. Elizabeth I had spent her young life learning how to stay alive in a court where one wrong word meant the Tower. Her mother had been beheaded. She herself had been imprisoned in the Tower at 20, suspected of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion against Mary. She had watched, learned, and said as little as possible. She became queen at 25 and immediately appointed William Cecil as principal secretary, a man of exceptional political competence who would serve her for 40 years. She restored the Church of England through the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity in 1559, creating a Protestant settlement deliberately broad enough to accommodate most of her subjects without forcing confrontation. She understood that governing a religiously divided country required flexibility over purity, and she applied that principle from her first weeks in power. The marriage question. For 45 years, every court in Europe, every session of Parliament, and virtually every Privy Council member pressed Elizabeth to marry and produce an heir. She never did. The diplomatic utility of courtship was real and calculated. She kept Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, and Francis Duke of Anjou engaged in negotiations for years without ever committing. Her closest personal attachment was to Robert Dudley, whom she made Earl of Leicester. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the foot of a staircase in September 1560, her neck broken under circumstances never satisfactorily explained, a marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley became politically impossible regardless of her feelings. Elizabeth cultivated the Virgin Queen identity deliberately in royal portraiture and court ceremony, transforming an absence into a symbol of sovereign power. Whether this was self-protection, strategy, or both, it worked. Until the very end, when the absence of an heir became the dynasty's final, fatal problem. Walsingham, Mary Queen of Scots, and the spy who ended a queen. In 1573, Elizabeth appointed Sir Francis Walsingham as principal secretary and gave him resources to build the most sophisticated state intelligence network in Elizabethan Europe. Walsingham ran agents across France, Spain, the Low Countries, and inside the English Catholic exile community. He intercepted letters, turned informants, and constructed operations that would not look out of place in a modern espionage thriller. His greatest was the exposure of the Babington Plot in 1586. In 1568, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, forced to abdicate after her husband Lord Darnley was murdered, and she married the prime suspect, had fled to England and thrown herself on Elizabeth's mercy. Elizabeth imprisoned her instead for 19 years. Every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth orbited Mary as the replacement queen. Walsingham constructed a sting. He allowed Mary to communicate through a channel hidden in beer barrel stoppers, let the Babington Plot develop fully, then produced Mary's letter giving explicit written consent to Elizabeth's assassination. Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587. The executioner required 3 strokes of the axe. When her severed head was held up, the auburn wig slipped away, revealing close-cropped gray hair beneath. The Spanish Armada, 1588 Philip II, had been building toward direct confrontation with England for years. English privateers, Francis Drake most prominently, raided Spanish treasure fleets in the Atlantic with tacit royal authorization. English soldiers and money openly supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. After Mary Queen of Scots' execution removed the last viable Catholic claimant Philip could support, he committed to invasion. He assembled the Armada, 130 ships carrying approximately 18,000 soldiers, intended to escort the Duke of Parma's army from Flanders across the Channel to England. The English fleet was smaller but faster and more effective at long-range gunnery. Fire ships launched into the Armada's anchorage at Gravelines on the night of August 7th to 8th, 1588, broke the Spanish formation and forced the fleet to scatter northward. Storms along the Scottish and Irish coastlines wrecked dozens of ships on the return voyage. Approximately 67 of the original 130 ships made it back to Spain. Elizabeth visited her troops assembled at Tilbury and delivered the speech that defined her reign. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. And of a king of England, too. The Elizabethan age, Shakespeare, Drake, and the edge of empire." The cultural and commercial expansion of Elizabeth's reign unfolded between the crises. William Shakespeare wrote the bulk of his plays during the 1590s. The Globe Theatre opened on the south bank of the Thames in 1599. Francis Drake completed his circumnavigation of the globe in September 1580, the second circumnavigation in history and the first completed by its original commanding captain, returning with enough plundered Spanish treasure to make his investors, including Elizabeth herself, extraordinary fortunes. The East India Company was chartered on December 31st, 1600, laying the commercial groundwork for England's later engagement with Asia. Walter Raleigh's second Roanoke colony of 117 settlers, including Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, had vanished without confirmed explanation by the time a resupply ship arrived in 1590. The final years darkened. The 9 Years' War in Ireland from 1593 drained the treasury and ended inconclusively. In February 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's last court favorite, led an uprising through the streets of London expecting popular support. No one joined him. He was executed on Tower Green. The Queen, who had survived everything, was now outlasting even the people she had loved. The Last Queen. Richmond Palace, 1603. Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace on March 24th, 1603, aged 69. In her final weeks, she had reportedly refused to eat, refused to go to bed, and sat for days on cushions on the floor of her chamber, staring at nothing. When Robert Cecil pressed her to name her successor, she indicated James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' Protestant son, 36 years old, already a capable king. He became James I of England, uniting the English and Scottish crowns under the Stuart dynasty. The Tudor line died with Elizabeth. The dynasty that had begun when a crown was pulled from beneath a hawthorn bush on a Leicestershire battlefield ended with an old woman on cushions in a palace by the Thames. The last of her blood, the last of her line, refusing until the very end to lie down. The crown found under that hawthorn bush in 1485 had no business surviving. The man who wore it had no real claim, no army worth the name, and no guarantee the nobility would accept him past the first year. But the Tudors did not just survive. They rebuilt England from the foundation. They gave it a national church, a stronger parliament, a Protestant identity distinct from Catholic Europe, and the commercial infrastructure that would eventually circle the globe. They did it through fire, execution, betrayal, and 6 marriages that between them produced more drama than most dynasties manage in 5 centuries. 5 monarchs, 118 years, a nation remade. And those 4 Latin letters, F.D., Fide Defensor, are still there on every British coin today. The last trace of a king who broke everything, rebuilt it in his own image, and somehow made it last. If you want to see what the Stuarts did with that inheritance, including a king who lost his head on the steps of his own palace, that story is next.